This video is just going to give a quick introduction into classifying hormones, and then in later videos we're going to go into detail about each different type of hormone. So to begin, when we're classifying hormones, we have three different types of classifications. We can either have amino acid derived hormones, peptide hormones, or steroid hormones. So to quickly define each of these, well, amino acid derived hormones are going to be hormones that are derived from amino acids. And most commonly, the amino acid that our human body utilizes is tyrosine. So tyrosine is the amino acid which other hormones can be based on. For example, we have epinephrine, and we can see that epinephrine looks very similar to tyrosine. It simply just has an additional OH group and some additional functional groups over here. So tyrosine is essentially the starting base where other amino acid derived hormones can form. And then we have peptide hormones. Peptide hormones, well, we can define peptide as several amino acids linking together. So over here we can see that we have several individual amino acids that are linking together via this peptide bond. So you can see this peptide bonding between this carbon and nitrogen. So, and then the last one is going to be steroid hormones. So steroids, all steroid hormones have one thing in common, and it's that steroid hormones involve these ring structures. So we can see that we have 3 rings that have 6 carbons, and then we have this one ring with 5 carbons. And that's going to be true for steroid hormones. They're going to be different variations of functional groups with this basic ring structure. Now, starting with steroid hormones, first of all, we need to understand that steroid hormones are essentially made up of lipids, and lipids, that would mean that it's lipid soluble on our cell membrane. But since they're made up of lipids, they're going to be water insoluble, because remember, if we think about lipids, we can think about fats, and we know that fats are insoluble in an aqueous environment. So if we had a steroid hormone in our blood, for example, it would need some sort of transporter because it is water insoluble. But once it reaches that cell membrane, well, our cell membrane is highly hydrophobic and it can allow non-polar molecules to pass through. So our steroid hormones are going to be lipid soluble when they're crossing that cell membrane. What's unique about steroid hormones is that since they're lipid soluble, they can directly pass through our cell membrane because the cell membrane is hydrophobic, and it passes through and it interacts with a receptor molecule inside the cytoplasm. So when it interacts with that receptor inside the cytoplasm, that steroid hormone can cause a direct effect on our protein translation. So essentially, what steroid hormones are capable of, they're capable of directly interacting with our nucleus inside that cell and affecting the transcription and the translation in which proteins are produced. Now, speaking about steroid hormones, an example of steroid hormones is testosterone. Now, remember, testosterone is that male hormone produced in the testes. Another example of a steroid hormone could be estrogen or progesterone. Now, a key point to know about steroid hormones is that they are produced in the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. So over here in this diagram, we can actually see the smooth ER and the rough ER. Now remember, the rough ER is covered by those ribosomes, whereas the smooth endoplasmic reticulum does not have those ribosomes. And that's the location of production. So now, I want you to think about the process of where lipoid hormones are passing directly through that cell membrane and interacting with our nucleus to affect transcription and translation. This process is actually slow acting because the process of actually creating those proteins from scratch, because the receptor is the hormone, it's going to affect our DNA transcription, which is going to affect our translation. This is actually a lengthy process because you have to alter the proteins that are being produced. So this is actually slow acting. And that makes sense because when we think about testosterone or progesterone and estrogen, these hormones, they do not cause their effects very instantly. It takes time. And that makes sense because, for example, during growth periods, we do not want growth to occur very quickly and suddenly. We want it to happen gradually over time. So it makes sense that these steroid hormones are slow acting. Now, steroid hormones, we have two different categories based on where they're produced. So we have hormones that are produced in our adrenal cortex. Now, our adrenal cortex is located right above our kidney, and it's right over here. So the hormones that are produced by the adrenal cortex are cortisol, aldosterone, and androgenic steroids. These are produced by the adrenal cortex. And then we have progesterone, testosterone, or estrogen, which are produced by our reproductive organs. So that could be, for example, our ovaries can produce estrogen, and the testes can produce testosterone, and so forth. Now, we're going to go into detail about each of these hormones in a separate video. This is just a quick overview. So we have steroid hormones are produced in the adrenal cortex or in the reproductive organs. Now we also have peptide hormones. So peptide hormones, remember that peptide is essentially multiple amino acids linking together via this peptide bond. Now, peptide hormones are different from steroid hormones because remember that steroid hormone was directly passing through that cell membrane because steroid hormones are lipid soluble, so they can pass through that lipid bilayer. But peptide hormones, they're lipid insoluble, so they cannot pass through that cell membrane. Instead, peptide hormones are water soluble. So you can easily transport peptide hormones through the blood in that aqueous environment because it is water soluble. But when you reach that cell membrane, there has to be some sort of receptor to receive the signal of the hormone because the hormone itself cannot pass through because it is lipid insoluble. So essentially then peptide hormones utilize a signal transduction pathway in which a receptor molecule on that cell membrane is going to receive that stimulus or signal from the hormone, and it's going to cause a cascade of reactions within the cytoplasm of the cell. So the first step of a single signal transduction pathway is the reception. So the hormone is going to send the signal to the receptor receives the signal. There's going to be the signal transduction. So remember that whenever we talk about signal transduction, there's going to be secondary messengers involved. So there's going to be several other molecules in here that are going to pass on that signal to further molecules. And as that happens, our signal amplifies because you're passing it on from one molecule to another molecule, and over time it'll amplify. And then we get some sort of a response. Now, this pathway of hormones is actually more fast acting in comparison to the steroid hormones. Now, the steroid hormones, they were going inside the cytoplasm, they were interacting with some sort of a receptor, and then directly interacting with the nucleus and affecting the transcription and translation of proteins. So that's a lengthy process because you have to change the proteins that are being produced. But in this case, you're taking ready-made proteins that are already there and releasing them to cause that response that the hormone wants. So this method of hormones is actually more fast-acting. Now, an example of a peptide hormone is insulin. So we can think about insulin, for example, let's say we have a very sugary meal. We know that after we have that sugary meal, insulin is going to be released fairly quickly because we do not want high blood sugar levels. So that insulin is going to act to bring down our blood sugar levels. Now, if, for example, let's say insulin was a steroid hormone, we can imagine that since steroid hormones are slow acting, and let's say we had that sugary meal and our sugar levels rise, that could be actually very dangerous if insulin was a steroid hormone, because since it's a steroid hormone, it would act more slowly, and we do not want that. We want to bring down our sugar levels more quickly because it can be very dangerous to have high blood sugar levels. And the production zone for peptide hormones is the rough endoplasmic reticulum. So now we can compare and contrast with steroid hormones. So steroid hormones are produced in the smooth ER, whereas the peptide hormones are produced in the rough ER. Now, going over all the peptide hormones, we have two different categories. The peptide hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus, whereas the peptide hormones that are produced in the anterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus are both located in the brain. The anterior pituitary we can actually see in this cross-section of a brain. So if we're looking at this cross-section on the inside, we can locate the anterior pituitary to be right here. So at the bottom over here, we see the pituitary gland. Now the hypothalamus we can actually see from this diagram over here, and it's located right below the thalamus. So the hypothalamus is right this region over here. These are the 5 different hormones released by the hypothalamus, and then these are the 6 hormones released by the anterior pituitary, and we will go over all of these in detail in another video. Now lastly, these are also 4 other hormones involved in peptide hormones, so the parathyroid, insulin, glucagon, and calcitonin. And lastly, we have our amino acid derived hormones. Now, from the name, we can tell that these types of hormones must be derived by some sort of amino acid, and that amino acid is tyrosine. Now, we can see tyrosine has that carboxylic group, that amino group, and this functional group with an aromatic and that OH group at the bottom. So, our amino acid derived hormones, they're based on this tyrosine over here. Now, when we talk about amino acid hormones, there's actually something unique about them, and that's that amino acid derived hormones can either be more like peptides or they could be more like steroids. Now remember that our steroids were lipid soluble and water insoluble. So T3 and T4 are 2 different types of hormones that are produced by our thyroid gland. And these act more like steroids, so that means that they are lipid soluble and they're able to directly enter that cell membrane. But when we talk about epinephrine is involved in our sympathetic nervous system, so that fast-acting response, our fight or flight response. And epinephrine is more peptide-like, meaning that it is water-soluble and lipid insoluble, so it will not directly enter that cell membrane. Instead, it will have some sort of a receptor on that cell membrane, and it will interact with that receptor. Now, the location of amino acid-derived hormone production is the rough ER and the cytosol. So once again, we can remember that our peptide and amino acid-derived hormones, they're produced on the rough ER, whereas the lipid hormones are produced on the smooth ER. And once again, these are more fast-acting. They can be more fast-acting if they're more peptide-like in comparison to the steroid hormones. Now lastly, these are the different types of amino acid-derived hormones. We have epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are produced by the adrenal medulla. Once again, the adrenal medulla is located right above that kidney. And then we have the T3 and T4, which is produced by the thyroid gland, and our thyroid gland is located at the front of our neck, and it's wrapped around the windpipe or our trachea, and we can see that highlighted in pink over here. And this is just a quick overview of the different classifications of our different types of hormones. Each of these hormones will be gone over in more detail in several videos.